The blood-orange sun dipped low over the horizon as Beatrice Davis rode into Kennewick, Washington Territory, 1876, her back straight as an arrow despite the exhaustion that threatened to claim her. The town's single dirt road stretched before her like an accusation, flanked by wooden buildings that seemed to lean inward, watching and judging. She'd ridden for 3 days straight after they'd run her out of Henderson, her former home, with nothing but the clothes on her back, her father's old journal, and the damning evidence that had cost her everything. "You'll be needing a place to stay, miss." A gruff voice called out as Beatrice dismounted outside the general store, her mare's flanks heaving with exertion. Beatrice turned, one hand still on her horse's reins, the other instinctively moving to the hidden pocket in her skirt where she kept her small derringer. "I might be." The old man who'd addressed her stood on the boardwalk, leaning against a wooden post. His eyes were kind despite his weathered face. "Widow Thompson runs a boarding house just down the way. Tell her Jeb sent you." "Much obliged," Beatrice replied, her voice carrying the faintest hint of her southern upbringing, a remnant of a life before the war, before her family had moved west seeking fortune, before she'd lost everything to corruption and lies. She led her mare down the street, feeling the weight of curious stares from the townspeople. Kennewick wasn't much a dusty frontier settlement fighting for survival against the harsh elements of the Washington Territory, but it was as good a place as any to disappear. The widow's boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure, painted a faded blue that had seen better days. Beatrice had just secured her horse to the hitching post when a commotion down the street drew her attention. A man on horseback tore into town, dust billowing behind him like a storm cloud. He rode tall in the saddle, his black hat pulled low over his eyes, his duster flapping behind him like wings. He reined his stallion to a stop outside the sheriff's office, dismounting in one fluid motion that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. "Sheriff." He called, his voice carrying down the street. Rustlers hit the north pasture at the Diamond T. The name caught Beatrice's attention. Diamond T, the largest ranch in the territory if the gossip she'd heard along the trail was correct. Curiosity momentarily overwhelmed her caution, and she found herself moving closer, staying within earshot as the sheriff emerged from his office. "How many head did you lose, Isaiah?" the sheriff asked, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. 20, maybe more," the cowboy replied, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of wet sand and eyes that reminded Beatrice of the summer sky back in Georgia. "Pa sent me to tell you they were heading east toward the pass." "I'll gather some men," the sheriff nodded, already turning back toward his office. "We'll ride at dawn." The cowboy Isaiah, the sheriff had called him, replaced his hat and turned, his gaze sweeping the street and landing squarely on Beatrice. For a moment, neither moved, and Beatrice felt something stir within her chest, something she'd thought had died the night they'd forced her from her home. She broke the connection first, turning abruptly toward the boarding house. She wasn't here to make friends or forge connections. She was here to start over, to find a place where her past couldn't find her. But as she reached for the door handle, she couldn't resist glancing back over her shoulder. Isaiah still stood there, watching her, a curious expression on his face. When their eyes met again, he touched the brim of his hat in a subtle greeting. Beatrice quickly looked away and entered the boarding house, her heart inexplicably racing. She had bigger concerns than handsome cowboys. She had a new life to build and old ghosts to outrun. The widow Thompson was a round woman with a stern face that softened when she smiled. She showed Beatrice to a small but clean room on the second floor, the window overlooking the main street of Kennewick. "Dinner's at 6, the widow informed her. "Bathrooms down the hall." "No men allowed upstairs, and I lock the doors at 10. "Thank you," Beatrice said, placing her small carpetbag on the narrow bed. "I won't be any trouble." "Where you coming from?" the widow asked, curiosity evident in her tone. Beatrice tensed. "East," she answered vaguely. The widow nodded, seeming to understand Beatrice's reluctance. Well, everyone comes west for a reason. Yours is your business. She moved toward the door. Rest up. You look like you could use it. Alone in the small room, Beatrice allowed herself to collapse onto the bed, the exhaustion of her journey finally catching up with her. She'd need to find work soon. Her meager savings wouldn't last long. But first, she needed sleep. As she drifted off, her mind replayed the image of the cowboy's blue eyes meeting hers across the dusty street, and she wondered what it might be like to be looked at that way by someone who didn't know the truth about her. Dawn broke over Kennewick with a clarity that only the frontier could provide. Beatrice rose early, washing her face in the basin provided before changing into her second dress, a practical navy blue that had seen better days but would have to do. She plaited her chestnut hair into a simple braid and descended the stairs to the dining room. Several of the other boarders were already at breakfast, two older gentlemen who appeared to be minors, a young couple who barely looked up from their plates, and a stern-faced woman who Beatrice later learned was the schoolteacher. The widow served a hearty meal of flapjacks, bacon, and strong coffee, explaining that she expected her boarders to help with chores if they were staying more than a night. Beatrice nodded her agreement. "I'll be looking for work today. Can you recommend anywhere that might be hiring?" The widow considered this as she refilled coffee cups. "Well, the mercantile might need help, or the hotel. They're always short-handed at the laundry, but that's back-breaking work." "I'm not afraid of hard work," Beatrice replied, finishing her coffee. "Thank you for the suggestions." The streets of Kennewick were already busy as Beatrice made her way toward the mercantile. The town was larger than it had first appeared, with a hotel, a bank, several saloons, a church, a schoolhouse, and a variety of shops catering to the needs of the residents and the surrounding ranches. The mercantile proved to be a disappointment. The owner had just hired a young man to help with the heavy lifting. The hotel wasn't hiring either, and the thought of the laundry made Beatrice's shoulders ache in anticipation. She was considering her dwindling options when a familiar figure emerged from the bank. Isaiah Thornton, for she had learned his full name from overhearing the widow's breakfast conversation, stood on the boardwalk, speaking intently with a well-dressed man who could only be the banker. He wore no duster today, just a simple blue shirt tucked into worn denim trousers, with a vest that matched his tan cowboy hat. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the wooden handle of his revolver worn smooth with use. Beatrice didn't mean to stare, but something about the cowboy drew her eye. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself, confident but not arrogant, strong but not intimidating. Or perhaps it was the way he'd looked at her the day before, with curiosity rather than suspicion. The banker nodded his agreement to whatever Isaiah had proposed, and the two men shook hands. As the banker returned to his establishment, Isaiah turned and caught sight of Beatrice across the street. This time, he didn't merely touch his hat. He crossed the dusty thoroughfare with purposeful strides. "Morning, madam," he greeted her, removing his hat to reveal hair that the morning sun turned to gold. "Isaiah Thornton of the Diamond T. Beatrice Davis," she replied, noting the calluses on his extended hand as she briefly shook it. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Thornton." "Call me Isaiah, please," he said, replacing his hat. "Everyone does except my father." Beatrice nodded, unsure what else to say. She wasn't accustomed to casual conversation anymore, not since the allegations, the trial, the exile. "You're new to Kennewick," Isaiah observed. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Beatrice confirmed, seeing no reason to deny the obvious. "I arrived yesterday, looking for work." Again, his insight surprised her. "I am." Isaiah seemed to consider something for a moment before speaking. "The Diamond T is looking for a housekeeper. Our last one left to get married last month. My father's been on my case about finding a replacement." Beatrice hesitated. A ranch would be isolated, away from town and prying eyes. It might be perfect, but it could also be dangerous for a woman alone. Isaiah seemed to read her thoughts. "It's a respectable position. You'd have your own room in the main house. My father, my brother and his wife and I all live there, plus a half-dozen hands in the bunkhouse. I appreciate the offer, Mr. Thornton. Isaiah, he corrected gently. Isaiah, she amended. But I don't know the first thing about you or your family. A smile tugged at his lips. Fair enough. Why don't you ask around town? The Diamond Titic's been here since before Kennewick was much more than a trading post. My father helped build this town. Beatrice considered this. It was a reasonable suggestion. And if I decide I'm interested, I'll be in town until tomorrow morning, Isaiah replied. We're riding out with the sheriff to track those rustlers. If you decide you want the position, I'll be staying at the hotel tonight. With a tip of his hat, Isaiah Thornton turned and continued down the street, leaving Beatrice with more questions than answers. But also, perhaps, with an opportunity. Beatrice spent the day inquiring about the Thornton family and their ranch. What she learned was unanimously positive. Isaiah's father, Edward Thornton, was one of the most respected men in the territory. He'd come west as a young man, established the Diamond T, and helped found Kennewick. He was fair with his workers and generous with his wealth, funding both the church and the schoolhouse. Isaiah and his older brother, James, ran most of the ranch operations now that their father was getting on in years. James had married a local girl, Margaret, 3 years prior, and they had a young son. Isaiah, at 28, remained unmarried, though not for lack of interest from the local young women, according to the talkative seamstress. By late afternoon, Beatrice had made her decision. She returned to the boarding house to gather her few belongings and settle her bill with the widow. The Diamond T, eh? The widow remarked when Beatrice explained where she was going. That's a good place. The Thorntons are decent folk. So I've heard, Beatrice replied, counting out coins for her one-night stay. The young one's got his eye on you, the widow observed with a knowing look. Beatrice felt heat rise to her cheeks. I'm sure that's not the case. He merely offered me a job. If you say so, the widow replied, not bothering to hide her smile. You take care now, and remember, if it doesn't work out, you've always got a place here. The unexpected kindness caught Beatrice off guard. Thank you, she said softly, truly meaning it. The hotel stood 3 stories tall, the grandest building in Kennewick. Beatrice hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of her travel-worn appearance. But she squared her shoulders and entered, approaching the front desk with determined steps. I'm looking for Mr. Isaiah Thornton, she informed the clerk. The man eyed her skeptically. And who shall I say is calling, Beatrice Davis, about the housekeeper position? The clerk's demeanor changed immediately. Ah, yes, Mr. Thornton mentioned you might come by. He's in the dining room. You can go right in. The hotel's dining room was modestly elegant with white tablecloths and polished silverware. Several tables were occupied, but Beatrice spotted Isaiah immediately. He sat alone by a window, a newspaper spread before him and a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up as she approached, a smile spreading across his face as he rose to his feet. Miss Davis, please join me. Beatrice sat in the chair he held out for her, acutely aware of the curious glances from other diners. I've been asking about your family, she said without preamble. The town thinks highly of the Diamond T. Isaiah retook his seat. And have you reached a decision? I have, Beatrice confirmed. I'd like to accept the position if it's still available. Excellent, Isaiah smiled, the expression warming his blue eyes. My father will be pleased. When can you start? Immediately, Beatrice answered. I've already settled my affairs at the boarding house. Perfect, Isaiah nodded. We'll leave for the ranch tomorrow after I return from riding with the sheriff. Say noon. That would be fine. A waitress approached their table. Can I get you anything, Miss? Beatrice hesitated, mindful of her dwindling funds. Please order whatever you'd like, Isaiah encouraged. Consider it a welcome to the Diamond T. Beatrice relented, ordering a simple meal of chicken and vegetables. As they waited for her food to arrive, Isaiah folded his newspaper and gave her his full attention. So, Miss Davis, where were you before Kennewick? Beatrice tensed. She'd anticipated this question but was still unprepared. Back east, she answered vaguely. East covers a lot of territory, Isaiah pressed gently. I'd rather not discuss my past if that's all right, Beatrice said firmly. It's complicated. Isaiah studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Fair enough, he finally said. Everyone out here is running from something or toward something, sometimes both. Beatrice felt a rush of gratitude for his understanding. Thank you. But, Isaiah continued, his voice low and serious, if there's trouble following you, I'd appreciate knowing about it. The Diamond T is my family's home. Beatrice met his gaze steadily. There's no trouble following me, Mr. Thornton, at least none that should concern your family. Isaiah held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded, apparently satisfied. Then that's all I need to know for now. They spoke of other things as Beatrice ate the ranch, the duties she would be expected to perform, the other residents of the Diamond T. By the time they parted for the evening, Beatrice felt cautiously optimistic about her new position. The next morning, as promised, Isaiah met Beatrice outside the hotel at noon. He'd returned from the expedition with the sheriff. Tired but successful, they'd recovered most of the stolen cattle and captured 2 of the 3 rustlers. The third one got away, Isaiah explained as he helped Beatrice into the wagon. But we know who he is. He won't get far. The Diamond T lay 10 miles outside of Kennewick, a sprawling property that encompassed fertile pastureland, forests, and a section of the river. As they crested a hill, Beatrice got her first view of the main house, a 2-story structure built of solid timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides. It's beautiful, she breathed, genuinely impressed. My father built it himself with the help of a few friends, Isaiah said, pride evident in his voice. He wanted my mother to have a proper home, not just a cabin. Your mother. Beatrice began, then hesitated, unsure if she was overstepping. She passed when I was 10, Isaiah supplied, his voice softening. Influenza. I'm sorry, Beatrice said sincerely. Isaiah shrugged, but the gesture couldn't hide the old pain in his eyes. It was a long time ago. Pa never remarried, said he couldn't replace her. As they approached the house, Beatrice saw a man emerge onto the porch. Tall and broad-shouldered despite his advanced years, with a full beard gone mostly to gray, Edward Thornton had the look of a man who had carved his existence out of wilderness through sheer force of will. That's Pa, Isaiah confirmed as he guided the wagon to a stop. Edward Thornton approached as Isaiah helped Beatrice down from the wagon. So this is the young lady you mentioned, he said, his voice deep and resonant. Yes, sir. Miss Beatrice Davis, this is my father, Edward Thornton. Mr. Thornton, Beatrice greeted him, extending her hand. Thank you for the opportunity. The older man's handshake was firm but not crushing. Isaiah says you're looking for a fresh start. The Diamond T-Ticket's a good place for that. Beatrice felt a surge of gratitude toward Isaiah for his discretion. I appreciate that, sir. Well, come on in, Edward gestured toward the house. Margaret's eager to meet you, been without help since Martha left us, and with the baby, she's got her hands full. The interior of the Diamond T-Ticket's main house was as impressive as its exterior, spacious and well-built, with good furniture and touches of refinement that spoke of Eastern influence. Beatrice was introduced to James, Isaiah's older brother, and his wife Margaret, a pretty blonde woman who cradled a chubby-cheeked infant on her hip. This is Edward Jr., Margaret said, bouncing the baby gently. We call him Eddie. He's beautiful, Beatrice smiled, genuinely charmed by the child's happy gurgle. And a handful, Margaret laughed. I can't thank you enough for coming. I was at my wit's end trying to keep up with the housework and this little monster. I'm happy to help, Beatrice assured her. Her room, as Isaiah had promised, was small but private, located off the kitchen. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the kitchen garden. It was more than Beatrice had dared hope for. It's not much, Margaret apologized as she showed Beatrice the space. It's perfect, Beatrice assured her, placing her carpet bag on the bed. Dinner's at 6, Margaret informed her. Until then, feel free to settle in and explore a bit. Tomorrow I'll show you the ropes." Left alone, Beatrice unpacked her few belongings. From the bottom of her bag, she retrieved her father's journal and the folded papers that had cost her everything. She had wrapped them in oilcloth to protect them from the elements. Now, she carefully tucked them into a loose floorboard she discovered beneath the bed. Not ideal, but better than keeping them on her person. The first days at the Diamond Tea established a routine that Beatrice found surprisingly comfortable. She rose early, helped Margaret with breakfast for the family and the hands, then spent her days cleaning, washing, and assisting with various household tasks. The work was hard but satisfying, and for the first time in months, Beatrice slept soundly at night. The Thornton family treated her with respect and kindness. Edward was gruffly paternal, James was politely distant, and Margaret quickly became something of a friend. But it was Isaiah who intrigued Beatrice the most. Unlike many men she'd encountered, Isaiah didn't seem to view women as delicate flowers or mere conveniences. He treated Margaret with brotherly affection, the ranch hands' wives with genuine respect, and Beatrice, well, that was harder to define. He sought her out when he was at the house, finding reasons to be in whatever room she was working in. He asked her opinion on things, books, politics, even ranch business occasionally. At first, Beatrice maintained her distance, wary of attachment. But Isaiah's easy manner and genuine interest gradually wore down her defenses. A month after her arrival at the Diamond Tea, Beatrice was hanging laundry in the yard when Isaiah approached, leading his horse. "Beautiful day," he remarked, gesturing at the clear blue sky. "It is," Beatrice agreed, pinning one of Margaret's dresses to the line. "I was thinking of riding up to the north pasture," Isaiah said, adjusting his horse's bridle. "There's a spot up there where you can see clear to the mountains. Would you like to come?" Beatrice hesitated, a pillowcase clutched in her hands. "I have work to finish." "Margaret says you're ahead on your chores," Isaiah countered with a smile, "and it's Sunday. Even God rested on the seventh day." Beatrice couldn't help but return his smile. "I'm not sure your father would approve of me gallivanting around the countryside." "Pa respects hard workers who know when to take a break," Isaiah assured her. "Besides, I already asked him. He said it was fine as long as we're back for supper." Beatrice felt a flutter of something in her chest, anticipation, perhaps, or something more dangerous. "I don't have a riding habit." "Margaret left one behind when she had Eddie," Isaiah replied. "She said you're welcome to borrow it." It seemed Isaiah had thought of everything. "All right," Beatrice relented. "Give me a few minutes to change." Half an hour later, Beatrice emerged from the house in Margaret's old riding habit, a bit loose in the bodice but serviceable. Isaiah waited with two saddled horses, a bay gelding for himself and a gentle-looking chestnut mare for her. "You look like you've ridden before," Isaiah observed as he helped her mount. "I grew up on a small farm," Beatrice admitted, settling into the saddle. "We had horses." They rode side by side away from the ranch compound, following a well-worn trail that wound through green pastures dotted with grazing cattle. The day was perfect for riding warm without being hot, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers. "I haven't done this in years," Beatrice admitted as they crested a small rise. "Riding?" Isaiah asked. "Taking time for enjoyment," Beatrice clarified. "Just being," Isaiah gave her a sidelong glance. "Life's been hard on you." It wasn't a question, and Beatrice didn't treat it as one. "Life's hard on everyone in different ways." "True enough," Isaiah nodded, "but some bear more than their share." They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythm of the horses' hooves a soothing backdrop to Beatrice's thoughts. The land around them was verdant and alive, a far cry from the dusty streets of Kennewick or the hostile faces of Henderson. "Here we are," Isaiah announced as they reached the top of a grassy hill. Beatrice gasped at the view. Before them stretched miles of untamed country, rolling hills giving way to distant mountains, their peaks still capped with snow despite the summer warmth. The river wound like a silver ribbon through the valley below, and in the far distance, she could just make out the smoke from Kennewick's chimneys. "It's magnificent," she breathed, drinking in the sight. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," Isaiah confided, dismounting and tying his horse to a small tree. "I come here to think." Beatrice allowed him to help her down from her mare, acutely aware of his strong hands at her waist and the brief proximity of their bodies. "What do you think about?" she asked, stepping back once her feet were firmly on the ground. Isaiah secured her horse beside his own before answering. "The future, mostly, what I want from life." "And what is that?" Beatrice asked, genuinely curious. Isaiah spread a small blanket he'd brought in his saddlebag and gestured for her to sit. "I love the diamond tea," he began, settling beside her but maintaining a respectful distance. "It's my home, my heritage, but sometimes I wonder if there's more to life than cattle and fences." "Like what?" Isaiah's blue eyes were thoughtful as he gazed at the distant mountains. "I'd like to travel someday, see the ocean, visit the big cities back east." He turned to look at her. "What about you? What do you want from life?" Beatrice plucked a blade of grass, rolling it between her fingers. "Peace," she said simply. "Safety, a place where I can be myself without fear." "What are you afraid of, Beatrice?" Isaiah asked, his voice gentle. Beatrice tensed, then forcibly relaxed her shoulders. "The past," she admitted. "And what happens when it catches up to me?" "Did you do something wrong?" Isaiah pressed, his tone free of judgment. "No," Beatrice said firmly, meeting his gaze. "I did something right, but sometimes that's more dangerous." Isaiah held her gaze, his blue eyes searching. "I believe you," he said finally. "And whatever it is, whenever you're ready to talk about it, I'll listen." The sincerity in his voice almost undid her. Beatrice looked away, blinking back unexpected tears. "Thank you," she whispered. Isaiah seemed to sense her need for a change of subject. From his saddlebag, he produced a small package wrapped in cloth. "I brought some of Margaret's apple tarts," he said, unwrapping the treats. "She claims they're the reason James married her." Beatrice accepted a tart gratefully, and they spent the next hour in lighter conversation about books they'd read, places they'd seen, funny stories from the ranch. By the time they mounted up for the return journey, Beatrice felt more relaxed than she had in months. As they approached the diamond tea, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Isaiah reined his horse closer to hers. "Thank you for coming with me today," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Thank you for inviting me," Beatrice replied, suddenly shy under his intense gaze. "I'd like to do it again sometime," Isaiah continued. If you're amenable, Beatrice knew she should refuse. Getting close to anyone was dangerous not just for her but for them, and yet, "I'd like that," she heard herself say. Isaiah's answering smile lit up his face, and for a brief, glorious moment, Beatrice allowed herself to forget about the past and simply exist in the present, with this man who looked at her as if she were something precious. The next few weeks saw a subtle shift in Beatrice's relationship with Isaiah. Their Sunday rides became a regular occurrence, eagerly anticipated by Beatrice despite her best efforts to guard her heart. They explored different parts of the Diamond T-Ticket's extensive property, sometimes bringing a picnic lunch prepared by Beatrice herself, sometimes just riding for the pleasure of movement and companionship. During these outings, Beatrice found herself sharing more of her past than she'd intended, not the circumstances of her exile, but smaller, safer memories. Her childhood on a modest farm in Georgia, her father's love of books that had instilled the same passion in her, her mother's death during the war, her family's westward journey afterward. In return, Isaiah spoke of growing up on the Diamond T, of following his father around from the time he could walk, of learning the ranching business from the ground up. He told her of his mother's gentleness and her insistence that her sons receive a proper education, even in the wilderness. He shared stories of his time at school back east, sent there by his father who wanted his sons to be more than just ranchers. "I hated it at first," Isaiah admitted as they sat by a small creek one warm afternoon. All those stuffy professors and boys who'd never done an honest day's work. But I came to appreciate what Ma and Pa were trying to give us. Your parents sound like remarkable people, Beatrice observed, trailing her fingers in the cool water. They were, Isaiah agreed, his expression soft with remembrance. Pa still is, though he's slowed down considerably in recent years. He glanced at Beatrice. He likes you, by the way. Beatrice looked up in surprise. Does he? Isaiah nodded. Says you remind him of Ma, not in looks but in spirit. She had the same quiet strength. The comparison touched Beatrice deeply. That's quite a compliment. It is, Isaiah confirmed. Pa doesn't give praise lightly. As summer gave way to autumn, the work on the ranch intensified with the approaching cattle drive. The hands were busy from dawn till dusk, and even Isaiah and James had little time for anything beyond the essential tasks of running the Diamond T. Beatrice found herself spending more time with Margaret and baby Eddie, helping with the endless work of keeping the household running while the men prepared for the drive. Despite the increased workload, she found herself content in a way she hadn't been since before the troubles in Henderson. One evening, as she helped Margaret prepare a hearty stew for the returning hands, Beatrice caught the younger woman watching her with a knowing smile. "What?" Beatrice asked, self-consciously tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "Isaiah talks about you constantly," Margaret said, her eyes twinkling. "It's Beatrice this and Miss Davis that until James threatens to gag him." Beatrice felt heat rising to her cheeks. "We're friends, that's all." Margaret's laugh was kind but skeptical. "If you say so." "But I've known Isaiah for 5 years, and I've never seen him look at a woman the way he looks at you." Before Beatrice could formulate a response, the back door swung open, and the subject of their conversation entered the kitchen, bringing with him the scent of horses and open air. "Something smells delicious," Isaiah remarked, removing his hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. "Just in time," Margaret smiled, exchanging a meaningful glance with Beatrice. "Would you mind calling the others? Dinner's almost ready." As Isaiah went to summon the rest of the household, Margaret bumped Beatrice's shoulder playfully. "Just friends," she teased in a whisper. "Right." Dinner that night was a lively affair, with the men discussing the upcoming drive and the women contributing occasional comments or questions. Edward Thornton sat at the head of the table, presiding over the meal with patriarchal dignity but a twinkle in his eye that reminded Beatrice of his younger son. "We'll be taking the Western Trail this year," Edward announced, buttering a piece of Margaret's fresh bread. "The Eastern route's too dry after the summer we've had." "That adds 3 days to the journey," James pointed out, bouncing baby Eddie on his knee. "Better 3 extra days than losing half the herd to thirst," Edward countered. Isaiah, seated across from Beatrice, caught her eye. "Have you ever seen a cattle drive, Miss Davis?" Beatrice shook her head. "Only from a distance." "You should come watch the start," Isaiah suggested. "It's quite a sight, 2,000 head of cattle moving out at once." "I wouldn't want to be in the way," Beatrice demurred. "Nonsense," Edward interjected. "The whole town comes out to see us off. It's something of a local tradition." "Then I'd be delighted," Beatrice smiled, her eyes meeting Isaiah's across the table. The morning of the cattle drive dawned clear and cool, a perfect day for beginning the long journey to the railhead at Walla Walla. Beatrice rose before sunrise to help Margaret prepare a substantial breakfast for the men, who would be riding out immediately after eating. The atmosphere at the table was charged with anticipation and excitement. Even Edward, who would be staying behind due to his advancing years, seemed energized by the familiar ritual. "Remember to rotate the point riders every 4 hours," he reminded his sons as they gulped down coffee. "And check the water holes before you let the herd drink. That dry summer might have left some alkaline." "Yes, Pa," James and Isaiah chorused, exchanging amused glances. They'd heard these instructions every year since they were old enough to ride with the drive. After breakfast, the yard became a flurry of activity as the hands made final preparations. Horses were saddled, bedrolls secured, last-minute supplies distributed. Beatrice stood on the porch with Margaret and Eddie, watching the organized chaos with fascination. Isaiah broke away from the activity to approach the porch, his horse already saddled and waiting nearby. "We'll be riding through town in about an hour," he told Beatrice. "If you'd like to see the herd from a better vantage point, the church steps offer the best view." "Thank you for the tip," Beatrice smiled. "I'll be there." Isaiah hesitated, then stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "I'll be gone for 3 weeks. I was hoping. Maybe when I get back we could talk." "Talk," Beatrice echoed, her pulse quickening at his serious expression. "About us," Isaiah clarified, his blue eyes intent on hers. "If there could be an us." Before Beatrice could respond, James called for Isaiah from across the yard. With a tip of his hat and a last lingering look, Isaiah returned to his duties, leaving Beatrice with her thoughts in turmoil. An hour later, Beatrice stood on the steps of Kennewick's small church, alongside most of the town's residents. The rumble could be heard before the cattle came into view, a deep, rolling thunder of thousands of hooves striking the earth in near unison. Then they appeared, flowing like a living river down the main street of Kennewick, a sea of horns and hides in various shades of brown and red. Riders flanked the herd, keeping the cattle moving in the right direction with occasional shouts and the strategic placement of their horses. At the head of the procession rode James and Isaiah, tall and straight in their saddles, directing the flow of the massive herd. As they passed the church, Isaiah scanned the crowd until his eyes found Beatrice. Even from a distance, his smile was radiant as he lifted his hat in greeting. Beatrice raised her hand in return, her heart full of emotions she dared not name. As the last of the herd passed through town and the dust began to settle, she remained on the church steps, watching until the distant figures of the riders disappeared over the horizon. First time seeing him off. A voice asked beside her. Beatrice turned to find Edward Thornton standing nearby, his weathered face thoughtful as he too gazed after the departing drive. "Yes," Beatrice answered simply. Edward nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "The waiting's the hardest part. But they'll be back before you know it." As they walked back to the wagon Edward had driven into town, Beatrice found herself wondering when exactly the Diamond T had become home in her mind, and when Isaiah Thornton had become someone she would wait for. The 3 weeks of the cattle drive passed slowly for Beatrice, despite the constant work that kept her hands busy from dawn till dusk. The Diamond T seemed quieter without Isaiah's laugh echoing through the halls or his boots on the porch steps. She told herself it was foolish to miss him so much. She'd known him barely 3 months, not nearly long enough to form such a deep attachment. And yet, in the quiet moments before sleep claimed her each night, she found herself replaying their conversations, remembering the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle way he'd helped her mount her horse, the earnestness in his voice when he'd said he wanted to talk about us. There could be no us, Beatrice reminded herself sternly, not with her past following like a shadow, waiting to engulf any happiness she might find. But the rational arguments of her mind did little to persuade her heart, which seemed to have developed a will of its own where Isaiah Thornton was concerned. 2 weeks after the drive departed, Beatrice was beating rugs on the porch when a rider approached the house. Her heart leapt before she realized it was a stranger, a tall man with a sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. Edward emerged from the barn at the sound of hooves, wiping his hands on a rag as he approached the lawman. "Sheriff Miller," he greeted the man. "What brings you out to the Diamond T?" "Official business, I'm afraid," the sheriff replied, dismounting. His eyes flickered to Beatrice, who had paused in her work. "Is there somewhere we can talk privately?" Edward frowned but nodded. "My study will do, come on in." As the men disappeared into the house, Beatrice felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Something in the sheriff's manner, in the way he'd looked at her, sent a spike of fear through her chest. Had they found her? Had someone from Henderson recognized her and sent word? With trembling hands, Beatrice returned to beating the rug, trying to appear calm while straining to hear any snippet of conversation from the open window of Edward's study. But the men spoke too softly, and the rhythmic thwacking of the rug beater obscured their words. After what seemed an eternity, the study door opened and the sheriff emerged, followed by Edward. Both men wore grave expressions. "Miss Davis," the sheriff called, approaching the porch. "Might I have a word?" Beatrice's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to respond calmly. "Of course, Sheriff." Edward stepped forward. "Perhaps my study actually," the sheriff interrupted. "I'd prefer to speak with Miss Davis alone." A flash of anger crossed Edward's face. "This is my home, Sheriff. Miss Davis is under my protection while she's here," the sheriff sighed. "Very well, but I warn you, this isn't a pleasant conversation." Back in Edward's study, Beatrice perched on the edge of a leather chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The sheriff stood by the window, while Edward took his seat behind the massive oak desk that dominated the room. "Miss Davis," the sheriff began without preamble, "I received a telegram yesterday from the authorities in Henderson, Wyoming. They're looking for a woman who matches your description." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face, but remained silent. According to their telegram, this woman stole sensitive documents and fled town after making slanderous accusations against several prominent citizens. The sheriff's eyes were hard as they fixed on Beatrice. "They want her returned to face charges of theft and defamation." "That's absurd," Edward interjected before Beatrice could respond. "Miss Davis is no thief." "With all due respect, Mr. Thornton, you've known her, 3 months? People aren't always what they seem." "What did she supposedly steal?" Edward demanded. "Financial records from the town bank where she was employed as a clerk," the sheriff replied. "Records that she then used to accuse the bank's owner and several town councilmen of embezzlement and fraud." Edward's bushy eyebrows rose as he turned to look at Beatrice. "Is this true?" Beatrice's throat was dry as dust, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "Yes and no," she managed. "I took copies of records, not the originals, and they weren't stolen, they were evidence." "Evidence of what, exactly?" the sheriff pressed. Beatrice took a deep breath, realizing that the moment she dreaded had arrived. There was no more running, no more hiding behind vague explanations and half-truths. "Corruption," she said firmly. George Kensington, the bank's owner, was working with 3 members of the town council to divert funds meant for Henderson's schools and public works into their own pockets. I discovered the discrepancies in the ledgers and brought them to Mr. Kensington's attention, thinking it was a mistake. "And," Edward prompted when she paused, "and he offered me money to keep quiet," Beatrice continued, her voice growing stronger as she told the story that had haunted her for months. "When I refused, he threatened me, said no one would believe a woman over men of their standing." "So you went to the authorities?" the sheriff asked, his tone slightly less accusatory. Beatrice gave a bitter laugh. "The sheriff in Henderson was Kensington's brother-in-law. The mayor was one of the councilmen involved in the scheme. There were no authorities to go to who weren't already corrupted." "So you went public," Edward surmised, understanding dawning in his eyes. Beatrice nodded. "I made copies of the relevant records and presented them at a town meeting. I thought once people saw the evidence, they'd have to act." "But they didn't," the sheriff guessed. "No," Beatrice confirmed, the memory still painful. "Kensington and the others denied everything. They said I'd fabricated the documents because Kensington had spurned my romantic advances." Her cheeks burned at the humiliating lie. The townspeople believed them. Why wouldn't they? They were respected businessmen, community leaders. I was just a woman, barely in town 2 years. "They ran you out," Edward said softly, a statement rather than a question. Beatrice nodded, blinking back tears. "They gave me an hour to pack my things and leave, said if I was still in Henderson by sundown, they'd have me arrested for theft and slander." She looked directly at the sheriff. "I'm not a thief, Sheriff Miller." I'm just someone who couldn't stay silent in the face of wrongdoing, even when it would have been easier." A heavy silence fell over the room as both men digested her story. Finally, the sheriff spoke. "The telegram asks that I detain you until someone from Henderson can come collect you," he said, his expression troubled. "And will you?" Edward asked, his voice dangerously calm. The sheriff ran a hand through his hair, clearly conflicted. "I don't know," he admitted. "On one hand, I have an official request from another law enforcement officer. On the other," he looked at Beatrice with new respect, "your story rings true, Miss Davis, and I've heard things about Henderson that make me inclined to believe you." "What sort of things?" Beatrice asked, hope flaring in her chest. "Rumors, mostly. Travelers passing through complaining about excessive taxes, strange fees that appeared and disappeared. Nothing concrete enough to act on, but enough to make me wonder." The sheriff straightened. "I need to think on this. In the meantime, Miss Davis, I'd appreciate if you didn't leave the area." "She won't," Edward assured him, rising from his chair. "Beatrice is a valued member of this household. She has nowhere else to go and, frankly, no reason to run, not anymore." The confidence in his voice brought fresh tears to Beatrice's eyes, tears she quickly blinked away. After the sheriff departed, promising to return once he'd made his decision, Edward remained in the study with Beatrice, his expression thoughtful. "You should have told us," he said finally, not unkindly. "I was afraid," Beatrice admitted. "Afraid you wouldn't believe me, afraid you'd send me away, afraid of bringing trouble to your door." She looked down at her hands. "I never meant to deceive you or your family, I just wanted a fresh start." Edward was quiet for a long moment. "You remind me of my Rebecca," he said finally. She had the same steel in her spine, the same unwillingness to look away from injustice. Beatrice wasn't sure how to respond to the unexpected comparison. "My son cares for you," Edward continued, his gaze direct. "A great deal if I'm any judge of such things." "I care for him too," Beatrice admitted softly. "More than I should, given my situation." "Your situation may not be as dire as you think," Edward replied. "Sheriff Miller is a good man." "Fair. If your story is as you've told it, I believe he'll do the right thing." "And if he doesn't?" Beatrice couldn't help asking. Edward's smile was grim but determined. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. The Diamond T protects its own, Miss Davis. And like it or not, you've become one of us." The next few days passed in a haze of anxiety for Beatrice. She continued her duties around the house, finding solace in the routine of physical labor. But her mind constantly returned to the sheriff's visit and what might happen when he returned with his decision. Margaret, having been informed of the situation by Edward, was a steady source of support. "Isaiah will be furious he wasn't here," she commented as they worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing preserves for the winter. "Perhaps it's better this way," Beatrice replied, carefully filling another jar with stewed apples. "He might have done something rash," Margaret laughed softly. "You know him well already." Beatrice couldn't deny it. In the months she'd known him, she'd come to understand Isaiah's nature, his quick temper when faced with injustice, his protective instincts toward those he cared about, his unwavering loyalty to his principles. "He'll be home soon," Margaret continued, sealing a jar with melted wax. "The drive should be returning any day now." The thought filled Beatrice with equal parts anticipation and dread. Would Isaiah look at her differently once he knew her full story? Would he regret his interest in a woman with such complicated baggage? She didn't have to wait long to find out. 3 days after the sheriff's visit, the hands who had remained at the ranch began shouting and pointing toward the horizon. The cattle drive was returning, a distant cloud of dust announcing their approach. Beatrice stood on the porch with Margaret, baby Eddie, and Edward, watching as the riders gradually took shape against the autumn sky. Even from a distance, she could make out Isaiah and James at the head of the column, their familiar silhouettes bringing an unexpected lump to her throat. As they drew closer, Beatrice could see that the men were tired but triumphant. The drive had been successful, the cattle sold for good prices. the journey completed without major incident. Isaiah's eyes found her immediately as he rode into the yard, a smile breaking across his dust-streaked face. He dismounted in one fluid motion, handing his reins to a waiting hand before striding toward the porch. "Welcome home," Edward called, stepping forward to greet his sons. James dismounted more sedately, immediately moving to embrace his wife and son. "Miss me?" he asked Margaret, his eyes soft as he gazed at his family. "Every minute," Margaret replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. Isaiah, after briefly embracing his father, turned to Beatrice. "You're still here," he said quietly, as if he'd half expected her to have vanished during his absence. "Where else would I be?" Beatrice replied, trying for lightness despite the weight of recent events. Something in her tone must have alerted him, for his expression grew serious. "What's happened?" Before Beatrice could respond, the sound of approaching hooves drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Miller rode into the yard, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. "Sheriff," Edward greeted him, stepping forward, "you've caught us at a good moment. The boys just returned from the drive." Isaiah looked from the sheriff to Beatrice, confusion evident in his face. "What's going on?" "Perhaps we should take this inside," Edward suggested, gesturing toward the house. In the study once again, Beatrice stood silent as Edward explained the situation to his sons. Isaiah's face darkened with each word, his jaw tightening as he learned of the accusations against her and the circumstances of her departure from Henderson. "So, Sheriff," James said when Edward had finished, "what have you decided?" All eyes turned to Miller, who cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I've done some digging," he began. "Sent some telegrams of my own, talked to a few people who have passed through Henderson, and I've come to the conclusion that Miss Davis's story has merit." Beatrice felt her knees weaken with relief, and Isaiah moved instinctively closer to her side. "The banker, Kensington, has a reputation that extends beyond Henderson," Miller continued. "There have been irregularities in other towns where he's had business interests, nothing proven, mind you, but enough smoke to suggest fire." "So you won't be detaining Miss Davis?" Edward pressed. "No," Miller confirmed. "I've already sent a telegram to Henderson informing them that I find no cause to hold her on their charges. I may have also mentioned that any representatives they send to pursue the matter will find themselves subject to close scrutiny regarding these other irregularities." "Thank you," Beatrice breathed, hardly daring to believe that her nightmare might be ending. "Don't thank me yet," Miller cautioned. "This doesn't mean they won't try again through other channels, but for now you're safe in Kennewick." "She's safe on the Diamond T," Isaiah said firmly, his hand finding Beatrice's and squeezing gently. "Anyone who wants to change that will have to go through me first." The sheriff nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "I thought you might say something like that." He rose to leave. "I'll keep you informed if I hear anything more from Henderson. In the meantime, Miss Davis, try not to worry too much. From what I've gathered, Kensington and his cronies prefer easier targets than a woman with the Thornton family behind her." After the sheriff departed, James excused himself to spend time with his family, leaving Beatrice alone with Edward and Isaiah in the study. "You should have told me," Isaiah said quietly, his blue eyes searching her face. "I was afraid," Beatrice admitted. "Afraid you'd think less of me." "Less of you," Isaiah repeated incredulously. "For standing up against corruption, for refusing to be silenced." He shook his head. "Beatrice, I could never think less of you for that." Edward cleared his throat. "I think you two have some talking to do," he observed, moving toward the door. "I'll leave you to it." Alone with Isaiah, Beatrice found herself suddenly nervous. He was looking at her with such intensity, such openness, that she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with her revealed past. "Before I left," Isaiah began, "I said I wanted to talk about us when I returned." Beatrice nodded, not trusting her voice. "I still do," Isaiah continued, taking a step closer. "In fact, everything that's happened only makes me more certain of what I want to say." "What's that?" Beatrice managed, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he must hear it. "That I love you," Isaiah said simply, the words falling between them like stones into still water. "That I want to court you properly, with the intention of making you my wife if you'll have me." Beatrice stared at him, speechless. Of all the ways she'd imagined this conversation going, this direct declaration hadn't been one of them. "I know it's sudden," Isaiah continued when she didn't immediately respond. "We've known each other only a few months. And I know your life has been complicated, that you've been hurt and betrayed by people who should have protected you. But I promise you this, Beatrice Davis, I will never ask you to be less than who you are. I will never silence your voice or dismiss your concerns. And I will stand beside you against anyone who tries to harm you, be they from Henderson or anywhere else." Tears welled in Beatrice's eyes at his earnest declaration. "Isaiah," she whispered, "you don't know what you're taking on. Those men in Henderson, they're powerful, connected. They could make trouble for the Diamond T, for your family." "Let them try," Isaiah replied, his jaw set in determination. "My family has faced worse and survived. We didn't build this ranch by cowering from bullies." "It's not that simple, it is that simple," Isaiah interrupted gently. "I love you, do you love me?" The question hung in the air between them, direct and unavoidable. Beatrice took a deep breath, knowing that her answer would irrevocably change the course of her life. "Yes," she admitted, the truth finally spoken aloud. "I do love you, more than I thought possible." Isaiah's smile was like the sunrise, slow, then brilliant. "Then the rest is just details," he said, reaching for her hands. As his warm fingers enveloped hers, Beatrice felt something shift inside her, a loosening of the fear that had been her constant companion since that terrible night in Henderson. It wasn't gone entirely. She doubted it ever would be. But for the first time, she could imagine a future where fear wasn't the driving force in her life. "They banished me for speaking the truth," she said softly, remembering the night she'd fled Henderson, the hostility of former neighbors, the betrayal of supposed friends. "Then I'll listen until they learn," Isaiah replied, drawing her gently into his arms. "And I'll keep listening for the rest of our lives." In the warm circle of his embrace, Beatrice felt the last of her resistance crumble. Perhaps there were no guarantees in life. Perhaps trouble would find her again. But she was tired of running, tired of hiding who she was and what she believed in. And here, with Isaiah, she had found something worth fighting for, worth staying for. The courtship of Beatrice Davis and Isaiah Thornton progressed with a speed that might have scandalized more conventional communities, but seemed perfectly natural to those who knew them. With Edward's blessing, Isaiah began officially courting Beatrice, though in truth, their hearts had been engaged long before the formal declaration. October gave way to November, bringing crisp mornings and occasional dustings of snow to the higher elevations around the Diamond T. The ranch settled into its winter routine, repairing equipment, tending to the breeding stock, preparing for the harsh months ahead. Beatrice continued her duties as housekeeper, but her role in the household had subtly shifted. She joined the family for all meals now, not just dinner. She sat with them in the evenings as Edward read aloud from the newspaper or James played chess with Isaiah. She helped Margaret with baby Eddie, learning the rhythms of the child's day, the little tricks that could soothe his occasional fussiness. And every Sunday, weather permitting, she and Isaiah rode out together, sometimes to his favorite hilltop, sometimes exploring new corners of the vast ranch. During these excursions, they talked endlessly about books and politics, about their childhoods and dreams, about the future they were beginning to envision together. "I want to build us a house," Isaiah told her one Sunday in late November as they sat wrapped in blankets on their hilltop, watching the distant mountains disappear behind approaching snow clouds. "Not far from the main house, but our own place." "Your father would miss you," Beatrice observed, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "He'll still see me every day," Isaiah replied. "But a married man should have his own home, don't you think?" The casual mention of marriage still gave Beatrice a flutter of disbelief and joy. "When?" she asked, turning slightly to see his face. Isaiah's smile was tender as he tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "Whenever you're ready," he answered. "Though I was thinking spring might be nice. April, perhaps?" "April," Beatrice repeated, testing the word, the idea. "That gives us time to build the house." "So it's a yes?" Isaiah asked, a hint of boyish eagerness in his voice. Beatrice laughed softly. "Did you doubt it would be?" "Never," Isaiah grinned, pulling her closer. "But it's nice to hear it confirmed." Their kiss was gentle but filled with promise of shared tomorrows, of a life built together on foundations of respect and love. When they finally broke apart, Isaiah rested his forehead against hers. "I want to give you something," he said, reaching into his pocket. "It was my mother's." He withdrew a simple gold band with a small but perfect diamond set into the metal. "Pa gave this to me before he died, hoping I'd find someone worthy of wearing it someday." Beatrice gazed at the ring, emotion tightening her throat. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like the woman who'll wear it," Isaiah replied, taking her left hand. "Beatrice Davis, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me here on the Diamond T?" "Yes," Beatrice answered without hesitation, her earlier fears seeming distant and inconsequential in the face of their love. "Yes to all of it." The ring slid perfectly onto her finger as if it had been made for her. Isaiah raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above the ring. "I love you," he said simply. "And I love you," Beatrice replied, the words coming easier each time she spoke them. They announced their engagement to the family that evening. Margaret squealed with delight, James offered his heartfelt congratulations, and Edward enveloped Beatrice in a fatherly embrace that brought tears to her eyes. "Rebecca would have been so pleased," he told her gruffly. She always worried about Isaiah finding the right woman, someone with spirit and principle. "She would have approved of you immediately." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of planning and preparation. Construction on Isaiah and Beatrice's house began immediately, with James supervising a crew of ranch hands and local carpenters. The location they'd chosen was perfect, close enough to the main house for convenience, but situated on a small rise that offered privacy and a stunning view of the surrounding countryside. As Christmas approached, Beatrice found herself happier than she'd been in years. The shadow of Henderson still lurked at the edges of her consciousness, but it no longer dominated her thoughts or dictated her actions. She had found a place where she belonged, people who valued her for exactly who she was: strength, principles, outspokenness, and all. The Diamond T celebrated Christmas with quiet festivity. The house was decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons. A tall pine tree stood in the corner of the parlor, and delicious scents wafted from the kitchen as Beatrice and Margaret prepared the holiday feast. On Christmas Eve, after a sumptuous dinner and an evening of carols around the piano that Margaret played with surprising skill, Isaiah led Beatrice to the porch. The night was clear and cold, stars blazing in the black velvet sky, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I have something for you," Isaiah said, producing a small package wrapped in silver paper. "But we agreed to exchange gifts tomorrow," Beatrice protested, though she accepted the package. "This one couldn't wait," Isaiah replied with a mysterious smile. Beatrice carefully unwrapped the gift to reveal a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she found blank pages, a journal, beautifully crafted with her initials embossed on the cover. "For your thoughts," Isaiah explained. "You once told me that writing things down helps you make sense of them. I thought you might like a fresh start for your new life." Beatrice ran her fingers over the smooth leather, touched beyond words by his thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," she said softly. "Thank you." "There's more," Isaiah prompted, gesturing for her to keep looking. Tucked between the pages, Beatrice found a folded document. Opening it, she saw that it was a deed to 20 acres of land adjacent to the Diamond T, registered in her name. "Isaiah, I don't understand," she said, looking up at him in confusion. "It's your land," Isaiah explained. "Yours alone, not part of our marriage, not part of the Diamond T." I wanted you to have something that was completely yours, something no one could ever take from you." Understanding dawned as Beatrice looked from the deed to Isaiah's earnest face. He was giving her more than land, he was giving her security, independence, a safety net should she ever need it. "You're worried about Henderson," she realized. "About what might happen if they come after me again." Isaiah took her hands, his expression serious. "I believe in us, Beatrice. I believe in our future together. But I also believe in preparing for all possibilities. If anything ever happened to me, or if those men ever made good on their threats, I want you to have options." The practical, protective love behind the gesture moved Beatrice deeply. "Thank you," she whispered, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. "Not just for the gift, but for understanding me so well." Isaiah smiled against her lips. "Always," he promised. The new year brought changes to Kennewick and the Diamond Tea. The railroad finally reached the town, bringing increased commerce and new settlers. The Thorntons' cattle business expanded, with Edward stepping further into retirement and leaving more responsibility to his sons. Construction on Isaiah and Beatrice's house progressed steadily, and by March, the structure was complete, a handsome two-story home built of local timber, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides and plenty of windows to catch the light. Beatrice spent her free time ordering furniture and household items, planning the garden she would plant come spring, imagining the life she and Isaiah would build within those walls. The wedding was set for April 15th, to be held in Kennewick's church with the reception following at the Diamond Tea. Beatrice had never been one for elaborate celebrations, but she found herself caught up in the excitement of planning the event with Margaret's enthusiastic assistance. "You'll need a proper dress," Margaret insisted as they pored over a catalog of fashions from Portland. "Nothing too fancy," Beatrice cautioned. "I want to be comfortable." "Of course," Margaret agreed, "but it should be special. It's not every day a woman marries the love of her life." Beatrice couldn't argue with that logic, and in the end, she selected a dress of ivory silk with delicate lace trim, elegant without being ostentatious, just like the woman who would wear it. As the wedding day approached, Beatrice felt a curious mix of emotions, joy and anticipation predominating, but threaded through with occasional strands of anxiety. Not about marrying Isaiah, of that, she was certain, but about exposing herself further to the world. A wedding announcement would be published in the Kennewick Gazette, which, while a small local paper, could potentially make its way to Henderson. Isaiah, ever attuned to her moods, noticed her preoccupation one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, enjoying the first truly warm evening of spring. "What's troubling you?" he asked gently, his hand finding hers in the gathering dusk. Beatrice hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm worried about the wedding announcement," she admitted, "about it somehow reaching Henderson." Isaiah was quiet for a moment, considering. "Would it ease your mind if we asked the Gazette not to run it?" he asked finally. "No," Beatrice shook her head firmly. "I'm done hiding, Isaiah. I won't start our marriage by cowering in shadows." Isaiah squeezed her hand, pride evident in his eyes. "Then we face whatever comes together," he said simply. "As we've always planned to do." The certainty in his voice calmed Beatrice's fears. Yes, there was risk in living openly, in loving openly. But the alternative, a life constrained by fear, relationships limited by caution, was no life at all. Not anymore. Not for her. "Together," she echoed, leaning her head against his strong shoulder as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. The 15th of April dawned clear and mild, as if nature herself approved of the union about to take place. Beatrice woke early in her small room off the kitchen, her wedding dress hanging on the wardrobe door, a visible reminder that by sunset, her life would be irrevocably changed. Margaret arrived shortly after breakfast, arms full of wildflowers she'd gathered at dawn. "For your hair," she explained, setting them carefully on the dresser. "Nothing too elaborate, but every bride should have flowers." The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Beatrice bathed in water scented with lavender, Margaret helping her wash and dry her long chestnut hair before arranging it in a simple but elegant style, woven through with the promised wildflowers. The ivory dress fit perfectly, enhancing Beatrice's natural grace and bringing a glow to her complexion that owed as much to happiness as to the spring sunshine streaming through the window. "You're beautiful," Margaret declared when the last button was fastened and the simple veil arranged. "Isaiah won't know what hit him," Beatrice laughed, a sound of pure joy that bubbled up from her very core. "I can hardly believe this is happening," she admitted, turning to look at herself in the small mirror. "Sometimes I think I'll wake up back in Henderson or on the trail and all of this will have been a dream." "Not a dream," Margaret assured her, adjusting a flower that had slipped slightly. "Though I understand the feeling. I felt the same way when I married James." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Edward's voice called from the hallway, "Are you ladies nearly ready? The carriage is waiting." "Just coming," Margaret called back, giving Beatrice one last appraising look. "Perfect," she pronounced. "Let's go make you a Thornton." The church in Kennewick was filled to capacity, the entire town having turned out to witness the marriage of Isaiah Thornton to the woman who had captured his heart. Beatrice paused at the entrance, her arm linked with Edward's, who would give her away in the absence of her own father. Nervous. The older man asked kindly, patting her hand where it rested on his arm. "A little," Beatrice admitted, "but in a good way." Edward smiled down at her, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You've made my son happier than I've ever seen him," he said softly. "Thank you for that." Before Beatrice could respond, the church organ began to play and all heads turned toward the door. Edward squeezed her hand encouragingly. "Ready?" Beatrice nodded, lifting her chin and fixing her gaze on the figure waiting at the altar. Isaiah stood tall and straight in a new suit, his hair neatly combed, his face alight with wonder as he watched her approach. Beside him, James stood as best man, grinning broadly at his brother's evident awe. The walk down the aisle seemed both endless and instantaneous. One moment, Beatrice was standing at the back of the church. The next, Edward was placing her hand in Isaiah's, the warmth of his fingers enfolding hers like a promise. "You're breathtaking," Isaiah whispered as they turned to face the minister. The ceremony itself was simple and heartfelt. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and unwavering as they promised to love, honor, and cherish one another for all their days. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Isaiah's kiss was gentle, but filled with such tenderness that Beatrice felt tears of joy spring to her eyes. "Mrs. Thornton," he murmured against her lips, and Beatrice felt a thrill at her new name, a name chosen rather than inherited, a symbol of the life she had built from the ashes of her old one. The reception at the Diamond Tea was a joyous affair, with tables set up in the yard under a canopy of strung lanterns. The ranch hands had built a makeshift dance floor, and a local string band played lively tunes that soon had everyone from children to grandparents stepping lively. Beatrice and Isaiah moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, sharing brief conversations and laughter. Sheriff Miller was there, raising his glass in a toast when he caught Beatrice's eye across the crowd. So was the widow Thompson, who hugged Beatrice tightly and whispered, "I told you so," with a knowing wink. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Isaiah found Beatrice deep in conversation with Margaret and several other women from town. "May I steal my wife for a dance?" he asked, extending his hand with a flourish. The women giggled and shooed them toward the dance floor where the band had just begun a waltz. Isaiah's arm slipped around Beatrice's waist, drawing her close as they moved in perfect rhythm to the music. "Happy?" he asked, his blue eyes searching hers. "Beyond words," Beatrice replied truthfully. "No regrets," Isaiah pressed, a hint of vulnerability in his question. Beatrice shook her head, her hand tightening on his shoulder. "Not a single one," she assured him. "This is the best decision I've ever made." Isaiah's answering smile was radiant. "I love you, Beatrice Thornton." "And I love you," Beatrice replied, the words coming as naturally as breathing. "Always." As night fell and the party began to wind down, the newlyweds slipped away to their new home, which awaited them just a short ride from the main ranch house. Isaiah insisted on carrying Beatrice across the threshold, setting her gently on her feet in the entrance hall that still smelled of fresh paint and new wood. "Welcome home," he said softly, his arms still around her waist. "Home," Beatrice repeated, the word filled with meaning beyond its simple syllable. After months of uncertainty, of running, of fear, she had found not just a place to stay but a true home in this house, on this land, with this man. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their new bedroom, Beatrice nestled against Isaiah's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, his breathing deep and content. "I never thought I'd have this," she confessed in a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the perfect moment. "Have what?" Isaiah murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "This happiness," Beatrice elaborated, "this sense of belonging. After Henderson, I thought I'd spend my life running, always looking over my shoulder." Isaiah's arms tightened around her. "You never have to run again," he promised. "Whatever comes, we face it together. This is your home now. These are your people." Beatrice raised herself on one elbow to look down at her husband's face, silvered by the moonlight streaming through the window. "Our people," she corrected gently. "Our home, our life." Isaiah reached up to touch her cheek, his expression solemn in the darkness. "Our everything," he agreed. Their life together unfolded with the changing seasons. Spring gave way to summer, and Beatrice's garden flourished under her careful attention. She planted not just vegetables and herbs for their table, but flowers, two bright spots of color that transformed the new house into a home. Isaiah divided his time between running the Diamond T with James and working on improvements to their property. He built a small stable for their horses, expanded the back porch to create a shady spot where they could sit on summer evenings, constructed a henhouse that soon housed a dozen clucking occupants. In July, they received news that momentarily disrupted their peaceful existence. Sheriff Miller rode out to the Diamond T one hot afternoon, his expression serious as he asked to speak with Isaiah and Beatrice privately. In the cool shade of their porch, Miller removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "I received a telegram yesterday," he began without preamble. "From the federal marshal in Cheyenne." Beatrice felt Isaiah's hand find hers, squeezing reassuringly. "George Kensington and 2 members of the Henderson Town Council have been arrested," Miller continued, his eyes on Beatrice. "Fraud, embezzlement, misappropriation of public funds." Beatrice gasped, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "How?" she managed to ask. "Seems your accusations didn't fall on entirely deaf ears," Miller explained. "A federal investigator happened to be passing through Henderson shortly after you left. He heard talk about the crazy woman who'd accused the town leaders of corruption. Got curious, started looking into things. And he found the evidence," Isaiah surmised, his arm now around Beatrice's shoulders. Miller nodded. "Turns out your copies weren't the only evidence. There were discrepancies in the federal records, 2 taxes that were reported collected but never made it to the territorial government." "So they're actually going to face justice?" Beatrice asked, still struggling to absorb the news. "They already have," Miller confirmed. "Trial was last month. All 3 got 10 years in the territorial prison." Beatrice felt tears welling in her eyes, tears of relief, of vindication, of the release of a tension she hadn't even realized she still carried. "Thank you for telling me," she said softly. Miller replaced his hat, preparing to leave. "There's more," he added. "The marshal asked if you'd be willing to testify in a civil case. Seems the new town council in Henderson is suing to recover the stolen funds." Isaiah's arm tightened protectively around Beatrice. "She doesn't have to go back there," he said firmly. "No, she doesn't," Miller agreed. The marshal said a written deposition would be sufficient given the circumstances of your departure from Henderson. I'll do it, Beatrice said immediately, sitting straighter. Whatever helps bring the full truth to light. After the sheriff departed, Beatrice and Isaiah remained on the porch, absorbing the implications of the news. You were right all along, Isaiah said finally, pride evident in his voice. Those men were corrupt and you were brave enough to stand against them. And it nearly cost me everything, Beatrice reminded him. Isaiah shook his head, turning to face her fully. No, he disagreed gently. It led you here to the Diamond Tea. To me, I'd say it gave you everything instead. Beatrice smiled at his perspective, realizing the truth in his words. If she hadn't been forced to flee Henderson, she would never have found her way to Kennewick, never have met the Thorntons, never have fallen in love with the cowboy who now sat beside her as her husband. You're right, she acknowledged, leaning forward to press a kiss to his lips. Every path, every choice led me here, and I wouldn't change a single step. As autumn approached, Beatrice began to suspect that their family of 2 would soon expand to 3. Her suspicions were confirmed by the local doctor, and she planned a special dinner to share the news with Isaiah. She prepared all his favorites: tender roast beef, fresh bread, apple pie still warm from the oven. She set the table with their best dishes, lit candles though the sun was still high, and waited with nervous excitement for her husband to return from his day's work. Isaiah noticed the special preparations immediately upon entering the house. "What's the occasion?" he asked, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. "Do I need an occasion to make a nice dinner for my husband?" Beatrice countered with a teasing smile. Isaiah laughed, drawing her into his arms for a kiss. "No, but I know you, Mrs. Thornton. You're up to something." "Perhaps I am," Beatrice admitted, her eyes shining, "but you'll have to wait until dinner to find out what." The meal was filled with comfortable conversation about their respective days, Isaiah's work with a new foal born on the ranch, Beatrice's progress on the quilt she was making for Margaret's birthday. But underneath, the normalcy ran a current of anticipation that had Isaiah eyeing his wife curiously throughout the meal. Finally, as they lingered over pie and coffee, Beatrice decided the moment had come. "I have something for you," she said, rising to retrieve a small package from the sideboard. Isaiah accepted it with raised eyebrows. "It's not my birthday," he pointed out. "Open it," Beatrice encouraged, resuming her seat. Isaiah unwrapped the package to reveal a tiny pair of hand-knitted booties. He stared at them for a long moment, understanding dawning slowly on his face. "Beatrice," he breathed, looking up at her with wonder, "are you?" Beatrice nodded, unable to contain her smile any longer. "Yes," she confirmed. "We're going to have a baby in March, the doctor thinks." Isaiah was out of his chair in an instant, lifting Beatrice into his arms and spinning her around the dining room, his laughter mingling with hers in a symphony of joy. "Careful," Beatrice protested through her giggles. "The baby." Isaiah immediately set her down, his hands moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "I'm sorry," he said, though his smile remained undimmed. "I'm just so. Beatrice, this is incredible." "You're happy then?" Beatrice asked, already knowing the answer but wanting to hear it nonetheless. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Isaiah replied, drawing her close again, more gently this time. "I'm ecstatic, overjoyed, blessed beyond measure." His enthusiasm was infectious, and Beatrice felt her own happiness expand to fill every corner of her being. This child would be born into love, surrounded by family, protected and cherished, free to grow into whoever they were meant to be. "I love you," she whispered against Isaiah's chest. "Both of you," she amended, including their unborn child in the circle of her affection. "And we love you," Isaiah replied, his hand cradling the back of her head. "Always and forever." The news of Beatrice's pregnancy was greeted with jubilation by the extended Thornton family. Edward was particularly moved, the prospect of another grandchild bringing tears to his usually stoic eyes. Margaret was full of practical advice and offers of baby clothes that Eddie had outgrown, while James teasingly warned Isaiah about sleepless nights and diaper duty. As Beatrice's body changed with the growing life inside her, Isaiah's protective instincts intensified. He insisted on hiring a ranch hand's wife to come in 3 times a week to help with the heavier housework. He built a beautiful cradle from wood he'd been saving for a special project, lining it with soft blankets Margaret helped Beatrice sew. The winter of 1877 was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter winds, but inside the Thornton homes, warmth and love prevailed. Christmas was celebrated with even more joy than the previous year, the anticipation of the new arrival adding an extra layer of excitement to the holiday. As February turned to March and the first signs of spring began to appear on the Diamond T, Beatrice's time grew near. The doctor from Kennewick visited regularly now, always leaving with reassurances that everything was progressing normally. "You're as healthy as any expectant mother I've seen," he told Beatrice during one such visit. "Strong as a horse with hips made for childbearing, you'll do just fine." Isaiah, who had taken to being present for these examinations despite the doctor's initial protests, looked relieved at this assessment. He'd been reading every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could get his hands on, his concerns growing with each new piece of information. "Stop worrying so much," Beatrice chided him gently after the doctor left. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time." "I know," Isaiah acknowledged, helping her to a comfortable chair by the fire. "But none of those women were you, none of those babies were ours." The simple statement, delivered with such earnest concern, melted Beatrice's heart. "We'll be fine," she assured him, guiding his hand to her rounded belly where their child kicked vigorously. "Both of us." Beatrice's labor began on a mild March evening, just as they were preparing for bed. The contractions were mild at first, easy to breathe through, and she sent Isaiah to fetch Margaret, who had experienced childbirth herself and had promised to assist when the time came. By midnight, the pains had intensified and the doctor had been summoned from town. Isaiah paced the hallway outside their bedroom, alternating between prayer and muttered reassurances to himself that all would be well. Inside the bedroom, Beatrice labored with determination, drawing on an inner strength that surprised even her. Margaret wiped her brow with cool cloths, offered sips of water between contractions, and murmured encouragement as the hours passed. "You're doing beautifully," the doctor assured her during one examination. "The baby is positioned perfectly, not much longer now." As dawn broke over the Diamond T, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, Beatrice gave a final, mighty push, and their child slipped into the world with a lusty cry that immediately set her heart at ease. A boy. The doctor announced, quickly cleaning the infant and placing him on Beatrice's chest. A fine, healthy son. Margaret hurried to the door to share the news with Isaiah, who burst into the room with tears streaming unashamedly down his face. He knelt beside the bed, one hand gently touching his son's dark hair, the other clasping Beatrice's fingers. "He's perfect," Isaiah whispered, awe evident in every line of his face. "Just like his mother." Beatrice smiled tiredly, her body exhausted but her heart fuller than she'd ever thought possible. "What shall we call him?" she asked, though they had discussed names extensively during her pregnancy. Isaiah studied the tiny face, now calming as the baby nestled against his mother's warmth. "William," he decided, using the name they'd chosen if the baby was a boy. "William Edward Thornton, after both our fathers." "William," Beatrice repeated, the name feeling right on her tongue. "Welcome to the world, little one. Welcome to the Diamond T." The spring and summer of 1878 passed in a blur of new parenthood. William, or Will as they began to call him, thrived under the adoring attention of his parents and extended family. He had Isaiah's blue eyes and Beatrice's determined chin, a combination that both delighted and occasionally exasperated his mother. "He's going to be as stubborn as both of us combined," Beatrice predicted as she watched 4-month-old Will repeatedly reaching for a toy just beyond his grasp, his face set in concentration. "Good," Isaiah replied, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside his son. "He'll need determination to make his way in this world." By the time Will celebrated his first birthday, he was walking unsteadily and babbling constantly, his personality emerging as curious and adventurous. The Diamond T became his playground, with Isaiah often carrying him on horseback for short rides around the ranch, pointing out cattle and horses, teaching him the names of things long before the boy could repeat them. Beatrice watched her husband and son together with a heart full of gratitude. This was what she had found in Kennewick, not just safety or a fresh start, but a true home, a family built on love and respect, a place where she could speak her truth without fear. The past hadn't disappeared entirely. Occasionally, Beatrice would think of Henderson, of the injustice she had faced there, of the people who had turned against her. But those memories no longer had the power to hurt her. They were simply part of the journey that had led her to where she belonged. On a warm evening in the summer of 1880, Beatrice sat on the porch of their home, watching Isaiah play with Will and their daughter, Sarah, born the previous winter. The children's laughter rang out across the yard as Isaiah pretended to be a horse, crawling on all fours with Will on his back, and Sarah toddling alongside, trying to keep up. Edward, now well into his 70s but still spry, sat in a rocking chair nearby, a contented smile on his weathered face as he observed his grandchildren. "You've built something special here," he commented to Beatrice, nodding toward the happy scene before them. "We all have," Beatrice replied, including the older man in her assessment. "The Diamond T is everything I never knew I wanted." Edward's eyes crinkled at the corners. "When Isaiah first brought you home, I had a feeling about you," he confided. "Something in your eyes, a fire, a determination. Reminded me of Rebecca. She had that same quality." "I'll take that as a compliment," Beatrice smiled, having heard enough about Isaiah's mother over the years to know what a remarkable woman she had been. "As it was intended," Edward assured her. "You were made for this life, Beatrice. For this family, just as we were made for you." The simple truth of his statement resonated deep within Beatrice's heart. She had been made for this, for love freely given and received, for a home where her voice was valued, for a family that stood together against whatever challenges life presented. Isaiah looked up from his play with the children, catching Beatrice's eye across the yard. The love in his gaze was as clear and true as it had been that day on the church steps, when they had pledged their lives to one another. He said something to the children, who immediately ran toward the porch, Sarah's chubby legs working double time to keep up with her brother. "Mama," Will called, scrambling up the steps to throw himself into Beatrice's lap. "Papa says to tell you he loves you more than the stars. Does he now?" Beatrice laughed, gathering her son close and making room for Sarah, who was determined not to be left out of the embrace. "And what else did Papa say?" Edward asked, winking at his grandson. "That you should all come see the surprise in the garden," Will announced importantly. Curious, Beatrice stood, settling Sarah on her hip as she followed Will down the steps. Isaiah waited for them by the gate to the kitchen garden, his expression a mix of pride and anticipation. "Close your eyes," he instructed Beatrice when she reached him. Bemused, Beatrice complied, allowing Isaiah to guide her forward a few steps, Will's excited giggles providing a soundtrack to the moment. "Now look," Isaiah said, his hands on her shoulders. Beatrice opened her eyes to see a new addition to their garden, a small stone bench set beneath the apple tree they had planted shortly after moving into the house. Carved into the back of the bench were words that made her breath catch in her throat. "They banished her for speaking truth," the cowboy said, "then I'll listen till they learn." "Isaiah," Beatrice whispered, tears filling her eyes as she recognized the phrase he had spoken to her years ago in Edward's study after the sheriff's first visit. "I wanted to commemorate it," Isaiah explained, taking Sarah from Beatrice's arms so she could examine the bench more closely. "The moment that changed everything. The promise I made and intend to keep for all our days." Beatrice ran her fingers over the carefully carved letters, each one a testament to Isaiah's love and dedication. "It's beautiful," she said, turning back to face her family, Isaiah holding Sarah while leaning against his father's leg, Edward watching from the porch with a contented smile. "You're beautiful," Isaiah replied, stepping forward to press a kiss to her forehead. "All of this our home, our children, our life together, it's beautiful because you're in it." As the sun began to set over the Diamond T, casting long golden shadows across the land that had become her sanctuary, Beatrice Thornton felt a peace that went beyond mere happiness. This was where she belonged, standing tall in her truth, surrounded by love, free to be exactly who she was meant to be. "Thank you," she said simply, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "For what?" Isaiah asked, shifting Sarah to his other arm. "For listening," Beatrice replied, her voice soft with emotion. "When the rest of the world turned away, you listened. You believed. You stood beside me." Isaiah's smile was as warm as the sunset painting the sky behind him. "And I always will," he promised, the vow as sincere now as it had been on their wedding day. For all our days, Beatrice believed him. In a world that had once tried to silence her, she had found not just a voice, but an echo, a love that amplified her truth rather than suppressing it. She had found home in all the ways that mattered. And as they walked back to the house together, their children laughing and playing around them, Beatrice knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future might hold, they would face it together, speaking truth, listening with love, and building a legacy that would endure long after they were gone.